Good morning. Thanks for joining me once again as we continue to look at key scriptures in the Bible. We are continuing in Exodus right at the moment, and we are going to look at the latter part of Exodus 13 and then chapter 14 about God parting the Red Sea, miraculously giving a deliverance and an exit for the Hebrews to escape Pharaoh and Pharaoh's army and to cross over from Egypt into the Sinai Peninsula. Okay. Now, to start out with, I want to ask you, have you ever been afraid? Particularly afraid to stand boldly for what God has led you to do, or to stand boldly in your faith, to make a stand that may not be popular, to make a stand that may be facing opposition of various kinds. Have you ever been afraid? I can think of quite a few instances in my life. The easiest ones, a lot of times, are ones where I'm in foreign countries and trying to minister in restricted countries. And one that comes to mind in terms of fear and concern was I was in a communist country and was going to set up delivery of hundreds of Bibles to one of the believers who then was going to pass it on to another group of believers. And so we needed to make contact with him, clandestinely. And so we had memorized uh, his address and how to get to his house because you couldn't take maps with you. You had to have everything memorized. And one thing I hadn't realized, or we didn't know, we weren't told about, was that as you started to enter into our contact's neighborhood, there was a police base or a military base there. It was the only exit and entrance into the neighborhood. And it said in several different languages, basically, no foreigners allowed. You cannot enter this neighborhood. You cannot enter this area. And in order to enter into the neighborhood, I had to walk past the guards who were standing at the gate and enter into the area. And I had to decide whether or not I was going to have fear and not do it, or whether I was going to trust in God and go ahead and walk into the area and trust that I would get by and trust that He'd take care of me. And praise God, uh, I walked by and they didn't stop me, didn't question me, and I was able to make contact with our contact in his house in that neighborhood, and then get out again. And then later that night, we met and were able to give him hundreds of Bibles in that place. But fear, fear is a common thing in various ways. We are often cowed by fear. We are afraid. We want to turn back. We want to, we are concerned. Well, I made a bad decision. I don't want to suffer the consequences. I don't want to suffer the consequences for my faith. I don't want to be ridiculed. I don't want my friends to think badly of me because I'm a Christian, whatever the case may be. And so we're dealing with that here in this passage, aren't we, in Exodus? And the key passage I want us to think about before we even get started is Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 and 14. This is the key passage. Do not be afraid, Moses tells the people. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring to you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. You need to stand. You need to stand firm. You need to continue on with what God has told you to do. That's key. That's key. Do not be afraid. Do not fear. How many times? I haven't counted, but throughout the Bible, whenever people are confronted by God or an angel or various things, they are told, do not fear, because fear is our enemy, especially when we're trying to do God's will and the world is opposing us. So let's take a look here at Exodus 13, beginning with verse 17. Now, I'm not going to read the whole, all the passages, because it's fairly lengthy, but we're going to focus on the key aspects of this slightly more than one chapter. Okay, so we're starting at verse 17 in Exodus 13. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road towards the Red Sea. And the Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. Now, if you're like me, a lot of times you kind of skip over that last verse. Are you aware of this? You don't think of the Egyptians. If you watch the movie, The Ten Commandments, for instance, on TV or anything, you don't think of the Israelites being ready for battle. But that's what Exodus says. It says the Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. They had been warned. They knew they might have to battle as they go along. That's the way life is. We're in a battle. We're constantly in a battle. And, there's a little side note I want to mention here, because it mentions Philistine country. And I just want to emphasize this again for current events, for today. We often hear about Palestine, okay? And I want us to think about this clearly. Palestine is a derivative term of Philistine, okay? I want you to understand this origin, okay? The Philistines were originally a European sea people who then made 5 cities along there in what is today Gaza, okay? And of course, they were longtime enemies of the Hebrews, of the Israelites there for a relatively short period of time, 200 or 300 years. So that's who the Philistines were. The Philistines were originally European people who then intermarried with some of the Canaanite population there. And so they were arch enemies of Israel. And you see that in the Bible, don't you? Well, they were basically forgotten. Those people had been wiped off the face of the earth, basically, about the same time that Israel or Judea was led off into captivity into Babylon. Also, the Philistines were completely squashed by the Babylonian Empire and hauled off, and they never reappear in history. They're done. The Philistines are done. They never reappear. And yet, it's interesting, the name Palestine is derivative of Philistine. That's what it actually means. And what it comes from is that after the Jewish people, after the Hebrews, the Israelites had rebelled against Rome in 70 AD, and of course that was defeated, and many Jews were killed and wiped out. Of course, the final battle basically was Masada, when everyone died to the last person, man, woman, and child at Masada. Okay, then about 60 years later, the Jewish people in Israel rebelled again in the Bar Kokhba rebellion. So there's another war against the Roman Empire. Okay, so the Romans come and defeat the Jews again. And this time, the Romans have had enough of the Jews. They hate the Jews. They want to be done with the Jews. And so what they do is that they declare that Jerusalem is no longer Jerusalem. It's no longer Jewish. In fact, Jews are not even allowed inside Jerusalem on pain of death. And not only that, but no longer is it going to be called Israel or Judea or anything like that. They rename the province Syria, Palestine, basically. And the Romans in the 130s AD go back in history basically 600 or 700 years to back when the Philistines were around. They were in this area just along Gaza, not Israel, but they had a little strip there. Basically, it was Gaza. And so the Romans, to insult the Jews and to remove all memory of the Jews, then name it Palestine, basically. Now, I want you to know that for current events. So when you hear about Palestine or Palestinians, realize that that's not really a real term. Okay, that's not a real term for a people per se. In fact, the Jews before, especially before 1948, the Jews that were living in what you might call Palestine were called Palestinians. So the Jews were called Palestinians, and Palestine at that point, when really the English revived this term, also when they were ruling the area, and so Palestine really included both Jordan and Israel, and it included all the inhabitants of the land. It was the Jews, it was the Arabs, it was everyone. Okay, and so I just wanted to give you a little bit of that background on the Philistine country. Now, the Philistines at this point, when the Egyptians, when the Hebrews leave Egypt, they are a people that have settled now in what is today Gaza, and they are a powerful people in many ways. They're small, but they're technologically advanced. They have the best arms, they have the best swords, the best javelins. They're an effective fighting force, very effective, and they're a sea-going people, so they're a sea power. And so God doesn't lead the Hebrews to go through Philistine areas because he's afraid that then, they're going to have to end up fighting the Philistines, and he doesn't want to do that. He wants to bring the Hebrews along gradually. He wants to train them. So he takes them this other route, and they have to cross the Red Sea, which forces them to have faith in God, right? And then they have to go into the desert and go across there, which requires faith. And so this is all part of God's plan. Not going the easy route per se that's going to result in war, which is not easy, but they could have easily gone into the promised land that way. That's an easy, quick trip in a sense. But instead, God has other plans for them. It's not that easy in certain ways, okay? So, but the Israelites went out of Egypt, but they were ready for battle. They needed to be, okay? And so then it says in the scripture, by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left his place in front of the people. So you see that God very much is with the Hebrews. He's very much with them. He's leading them. It's not Moses that's leading the people per se, but rather it is God. He's leading them like a shepherd would lead his sheep, as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Okay? So we're in chapter 14. We're going to read from chapter 14, verse 5 now. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services. So he had his chariots made ready and took his army with him. And he took 600 of the best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out of the country boldly. Okay. Now I want you to think chariots. We don't think of that as being that important maybe today. We're just not informed, or we think about tanks, for instance. That's a good analogy today. Well, that's basically what chariots were. Chariots were the tanks of their day. They were very powerful because they were very swift and they could move. And if you were facing chariots, for instance, and you didn't have chariots, if you were just on foot, you were in trouble. And so for Pharaoh to take these chariots, these swift chariots with expert marksmen on them and everything, you're toast in most instances. You're not going to survive that if you are a less well-armed foe that has no chariots. You just don't have a chance. So Pharaoh and the people of Egypt, isn't this typical of sin though? This is typical of addiction. We make resolutions to change things. We decide we're going to change things. We are sorry for what we've done wrong. But then all at once we realize, oh, but I missed this. I missed that. And then we backslide and we go back on what we had thought we were going to do. We make a resolution at the beginning of the year. I'm going to lose 10 pounds. I'm going to change my diet. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, well, I really miss those French fries. I really miss those milkshakes. Whatever it is, I really miss that. And then we go back on it. That's what happens here, isn't it? So Pharaoh and the Egyptians realize what they have lost. Yes, they realize that they lost a lot. That God punished them, but they just, what are they? Oh, we got to have our slaves. Perhaps it's a little bit like the American South with the Civil War, isn't it? Because after all, I mean, you suffer the worst war in American history. Look at what it cost, not just the North, but especially the South. Why? Because they would not give up their slaves. And that's what you see here with Pharaoh and the Egyptians. So as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up. And there were the Egyptians marching after them, coming after them, and they were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us be slaves to the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. So, see, it's not just the Egyptians who are backpedaling, is it? It's out of fear. The Hebrews are afraid now. They still have a slave's heart, don't they? They're used to serving, they're used to being oppressed. When they see the oppression coming once again, even though God has delivered them, even though God has shown he's got a mighty arm who can deliver them, they immediately are terrified. And they say, what'd you bring us out here for, Moses? Now we're going to die. Didn't we tell you before in Egypt? Well, leave us alone. We'll go ahead and serve the Egyptians. So you still have the slave mentality, don't you? And Moses answers the people. This is our key verse, isn't it? Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. What's required of us by God? This is true. Don't be afraid. Stand firm. See, so much of the time, we don't even need to move forward. We don't even need to engage in the battle. What's required is that we just don't turn tail and run. What's required is we stand firm. Our knees may be trembling. And yet we still put our faith in God. We say, here I stand, I can do no other. That's what Martin Luther said in front of all the authorities when he was being tried. He said, here I stand, I can do no other. That's what we're supposed to do. We stand firm. And when we do, God will fight for us. We don't have to do our own fighting. The Lord will fight for us if we will stand firm. But if we turn tail and run, we are truly lost then. We've got to stand firm and not fear. And then God will see us through. Yes, we may see fearsome things. As we stand there, we're going to see the chariots coming at us. We're going to see the swords. We're going to see the javelins. We're going to see Pharaoh coming in all of his regalia. We're going to see terrible, awesome things. We're going to see, and we're going to be afraid maybe, but we need to gird ourselves up with the power of God, ask God to fill us anew with the Holy Spirit, and to be strong, and to not run away, but to stand and to watch God fight for us and defeat this foe. And it may be fearsome, and there may be chaos, and all sorts of things going on all around us, but we still need to stand firm. Verse 19. Then the angel of God who had been traveling in front of Israel's army withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, to the Hebrews. So neither side went near the other all night long. Which side are you on? Are you on the dark side or are you on the light side? Verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. And they walked through because they stood their ground, because they stood firm and they were not afraid, or they tried not to be, right? So they went on. And I want just a side note here. I just want to bring up, once again, I've mentioned this before, but so many of the things that are in Egypt are redone in the ministry of Jesus in different ways. And it's not a one-to-one thing necessarily, but I want you to think in terms of how them going through the Red Sea also connects with Jesus walking on the water, that miracle on the water. You can think of its connection also with baptism. You could make the argument that on that day, even though they didn't get wet per se, the Hebrews were baptized into their covenant with God. They did not run in the other way. They stood firm and they walked on through the waters. They came through the waters, signifying they were dying to that old slave life and they were being reborn into a new life of freedom in God. Okay? So it's like baptism. Just think of that in Jesus ministry redoes a lot of these miracles and things that happen with the Exodus. Think of the manna here later in the wilderness that God miraculously gives to the Hebrews. That ties into Jesus' feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. You can think of the living water in Jesus' ministry. You can think of Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness as being a kind of being 40 years in the wilderness that the Hebrews ended up doing. Okay, there's connections here. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to bring up to you that the things in the Old Testament are not just for the Old Testament, they're also for the New, and vice versa. The two are intimately connected. So many Christians do not pay any attention hardly to the Old Testament. That's wrong. We need to be aware of what's in the Old Testament. You know, maybe I've mentioned this before, but this is something I didn't make it up myself, but I just love this comment. It's a comment about how Jews and Christians kind of how they do things. And it's like a play. There's a play. Imagine that there's a play being done. And the Jews come to the first act and they think that's the end of the play. So they leave. Then the Christians come after the first act is ended and just see the second act and they think that's the whole play. Well, no, the whole play is both acts. It's both parts. It's both the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? It's both the Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, the law and the prophets and the writings, and the gospel, and all of the letters of Paul, etc., in the New Testament, right? Need to remember that. So let's continue on then. So let's see, where am I at? Yeah. So, verse 26. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived. What is God doing here? Well, he's making sure, for one thing, that the new people of Hebrew people, the new Israel, especially when they come into the land, are not going to be overly bothered by the mighty Egyptian army or the mighty Egyptian empire. You've got to remember that historically, like for instance under Ramesses II, that the Egyptians controlled all of what becomes Israel, going up clear up basically to the Lebanese border. You've got to remember that the Egyptians have been powerful in this area. And so what is God doing? He's not just delivering the Hebrews today, but he's delivering them tomorrow as well. See, God has a plan for us. He has plans for us to prosper, plans for us to do his will and to become prosperous in his will, to be successful. And that's what God's doing here. And you notice it's also, of course, judgment on the Egyptians. And from this point on, basically, the Egyptians never become the same mighty people or mighty nation that they were in the past. They never again recapture the glory that was had with ancient Egypt. Basically, their glory days are over. That's the judgment on them for holding the Hebrews and abusing them and having them as slaves. That's the judgment. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses' his servant. Now, this is a kind of a sad commentary. It almost sounds as though finally, after seeing all these plagues visited upon Egypt, after seeing Passover deliverance, after seeing all this stuff, all these mighty things that God is doing, the people don't really fear God and don't really trust in him until, and in Moses, his servant, until they have the Red Sea parted, until they see God's deliverance from the chariots and the mighty army of Egypt. Then they put their faith and trust. But of course, even then, the other worse, even worse commentary is that even that faith and that trust is pretty halting. And we soon see how halting it is as they go into the wilderness, don't we? So, once again, what's our key verse? Keep this in mind. Think about it. Meditate upon it. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance of the Lord, the deliverance that he will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. See the enemies that you are facing. God can defeat no matter how awesome they may appear. And once God defeats those enemies, you may never see them again, right? Keep that in mind. Okay, but we have to make sure we don't fear, and that's hard. We face many things. We face peer pressure. We face pressures on jobs. We face financial pressures. We face pressures from family and friends and from the media. The media wants us to cower down and be little clones. It wants us to think a certain way. The government's this way. Also, that's what the world is. That's what the world really always has been. The world is in opposition to God. We've got to stand against that. We've got to stand against culture. We've got to stand firm. See, faith in Jesus. We need to have faith in Jesus. Hold on to that. That's the number one thing. Also, we need to be committed to God's commandments. See, faith is a nebulous thing if it doesn't have any content. You got to remember that God has commandments in the scriptures. If we're God's people, we are to be living according to those commandments, right? We must do that. And we must have faithfulness to living according to the scriptures. We must study the scriptures and live according to the scriptures and according to the Spirit's leading. That is what standing firm means. And when we do that, then God will take care of us. Now, it may not be easy. It's like the Hebrews. It may be a hard road. You may be in the desert. You may be facing an army coming against you. You may be in between a rock and a hard place. And God may have to part the Red Sea for you. But that's okay. God will do that. You may have to go through the wilderness for 40 years, but that's okay. God will give you water and manna and will supply everything you need if you will trust and not grumble against Him. You need to be perseverant. We all need to be perseverant and to stand firm, and we will see the victory of God. That's the promise of God. That's the lesson of this passage. Stand firm. Do not be afraid. Hope you have a wonderful week. The Lord bless you. Bye bye.